Well, let's jump right into another study on eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events. My name is Aryaman Lyman Hanavi. Looking at my screen, we've already worked our way through topic 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we're poised on topic 5, Book of Daniel, the 70 weeks of Daniel. I'm going to try and finish the overview of Daniel's 70 weeks, which we're reading through Daniel chapter 9, verses 24, 25, 26, and 27, so that we can begin to deal with the specific last final week, otherwise known as the 70th week of Daniel. Maybe we'll hit that starting next week, but I believe we can finish the overview first. When I say overview, what I mean is just those 4 verses. So let me read those 4 verses for you. Let's scroll back up a little bit. There we go. This is the NASB version of the Bible, and let me read these 4 verses for you, and then we'll jump into what I have to say. NASB reads this way: 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Verse 25, so you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Verse 26, then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. And then the final pasuk, verse 27, and he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. Okay, so what we've been doing is working our way through an understanding of the most basic of what I like to refer to as the popular view of these passages, what we might call the traditional Christian perspective. I am aware that there are differing translations that yield different understandings, and so I don't want to make this very complicated, but I do want to make you aware of the different translations and just briefly let me see if I can hit this in 5 minutes at the most, and make you aware of the fact of just a translation difference with different punctuation will cause you to make this passage about Jesus, or there's a way to take him out of the picture altogether and produce an entirely kind of radical different way of looking at this. Now, I've talked in the past about the differences between the interpretive views of end-time prophecy. We already know there's at least 4 different views of the book of Revelation and end-time prophecy. We've got the preterist view, the idealist view, the historicist view, and the futurist view. And I myself, as a Bible teacher, hold to the futurist perspective. That is to say, most of the end-time prophecies, for instance, in the book of Revelation, are specifically for the future, with an understanding that much of what has already happened in the past is past history. The complete kind of polar opposite of my perspective, futurist, would be the perspective that I do not hold to, but a perspective that I'm making you aware of from time and time again, which is the preterist view. Preterist view, at least in its extreme forms, there's 2 versions. There's preterist, and then there's full preterist, and there's partial preterist. And then the extreme version, the full preterist, or we could call it hyper preterist, takes the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation and the prophecies that we're reading about, and it puts everything into the past, particularly right around 70 AD when the temple was destroyed and Jerusalem was destroyed, and 70 AD, and then 130s when the Jewish wars broke out, and finally Rome just plowed Jerusalem under, kicked all the Jews out. So what the preterist view does is it says there's really nothing left in the book of Revelation or the book of Daniel here to look forward to. And I reject that view for a number of reasons. Even partial preterism has a number of disturbing details that I just can't really get on board with. Having said that, however, I do recognize that some of what Daniel is prophesying about is past history, and what some of what the book of Revelation talks about tells us, informs us from past historical events as well. So I do believe there's this kind of near-far aspect to end-time prophecy. We've seen the little chart that I keep putting on the screen. I'm not going to do it tonight for you, but it's a little prophetic, what we call telescoping, where a prophet is looking at an event that God tells him about in the spirit, and to the prophet it looks like perhaps one mountain peak, but in reality it's two mountain peaks separated by a gap between the mountain peaks, and the near mountain peak, the one closest to the prophet, is what he really sees kind of happening near to him. But in reality there might be something far that God is implying by the second mountain peak. So there's a telescoping effect going on that the prophet may or may not be aware of, and so we get one prophecy, but yet there are two occurrences, one near to the prophet and a far fulfillment farther away into the future. And sometimes it's a partial fulfillment close to the prophet and a final fulfillment, so it's kind of cut in half in the sense that it's partially fulfilled in some ways, and then it waits a future final full fulfillment. And other times it's just a repeat of almost everything, just type and shadow effect, right? Kind of like the way Yeshua's effect of dying on the cross and reconciling us to God through his sacrifice was typified in the Old Testament by the sacrifices of the animals themselves. So we see that is not really so much as a partial fulfillment, more as so much as we would describe it as a shadow fulfillment. So a shadow and then the reality. So we have some of that going on in the prophecies as well. So having said that, when we're looking at the book of Daniel right now, I want to make you aware of the fact that the two opposing views of preterism and futurism, they're kind of like the two polar opposites. The historicist view and idealist view, they kind of work together with one another. They don't really cancel each other out. But the preterism view and the futurist view, they're kind of on the polar opposites, the extremes of or I shouldn't say extremes, but they're really almost opposing each other when they meet on the table. And so the book of Daniel, chapter 9, verse 25, let me scroll down to that one again. This is a verse that really kind of sets the tone for either a preterist perspective or a futurist. And so let me read Daniel 9:25 out of some different versions real quick and just show you what is driving some of the interpretations or driving some of the perspectives based on interpretation. Real quick, if you look at the screen right now, the NIV version has this punctuation in the English, which, if you remember from the original Hebrew, there's really no punctuation except what is driven by either context or by the Masoretic tradition, who added little dots and dashes underneath all of the pieces of the original consonants. Let me just show you the Hebrew real quick so you guys can follow along. So you see I've got verse 25 pulled up in the Hebrew right here, and you see a bunch of little dots and dashes after the letters or after the consonants. But those dots and dashes were added in the 4th century, if I remember, after the Common Era, so 4th century AD, if I remember. And that means the original scroll that Daniel wrote, or the original writing that Daniel put together, even the original scrolls that were accessible to the Jewish people and the 1st century followers, Yeshua himself included, all of those people had access to scrolls that didn't have any dots or dashes. So the traditions that were passed along in Judaism as to where what we might consider the breaks in punctuation show up is a matter of something that we're more accustomed to looking at with all of our commas and semicolons and colons more than what they were looking at. So they didn't even have verse breaks. I mean, we've got verse 25 in our English renderings, but they didn't even have the verse breaks. So all of these things were added later, right? Verse breaks, chapter breaks, paragraph breaks. Well, maybe not paragraph breaks. Those are put in by the Masoretes as well. But germane to our study are the punctuation marks. So look at Daniel 9:25 specifically. And the only punctuation mark I want you to really, really zero in on is the one after the phrase, the ruler, let's see, let me just read it this way. Know and understand this, from the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem unto the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens, period. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. So, in the phrase right here, let me just highlight it for you. Let's see, from the time of there will be, okay, this clause right here, there will be 7 sevens, comma, and 62 sevens. So in the NIV version, right away, because of the comma after the word sevens and the period after the second sevens, we see that basically the NIV is informing us that the events that it just described, or i.e., from the time frame of the going out to restore and rebuild until, so those are the beginning and ending markers, until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be this amount of time that passes by. 7 sevens and 62 sevens. We've already established that these sevens are heptads, units of 7, but by context, they imply years. Okay, so what we're seeing here in the NIV version is that there will be 7 plus 62, even though it's broken up into a series of a clump of sevens and then a clump of 62, nevertheless, we still have a starting and an ending point that equals 69 sevens. Now, when we translate this into the 77s, we end up with 483 years. So what we're seeing is that, according to the NIV version, this anointed one who shows up at the end of the 483 years after the 69 sevens. You guys are seeing that, right? And it's based on a simple addition of commas and periods in the English version. So that's going to drive our translation questions. Same thing in NLT. We have the exact same feature going on, basically. Let me just highlight them. There will be, let's say, they put the 7 sevens and 62 sevens a little higher up into the translation, but it's the same concept. 7 sets of 7 plus 62 sets of 7 will pass. So they are also agreeing that it's going to be 483 years from the beginning of the decree to when the Messiah shows up and does something significant. 69 sevens, or 483 years. But watch what happens when we start to get to a version known as the ESV, the version I was fond of using for the longest time, but I've now switched over to NASB. Let me read this one. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of the anointed one, so still starting and ending, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks, period. And then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat. Notice that in their translation, they put a period after the first 7 weeks, and then there's a break for a new sentence. Then for 62 weeks, it should be built again. It almost implies here, and I think it does, that the anointed one is going to show up after the 7-week period and not after the 69-week period, or after the first 7 sevens, and not after the additional 62 sevens. So it moves up the arrival of the Messiah by a good 62 weeks, or 62 sevens, or the time period between the first 7 and the second, i.e. the 483 years. So what are we to make of the ESV? Well, we'll have to look at that here in a bit. But other than that, the Berean Standard follows the traditional reading. It puts the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks together. KJV does the same thing. It puts the 7 weeks and the 62 weeks together using the what we call the periods and the commas, right? So the punctuation. It puts them together. New King James, same thing. NASB does the same thing. All versions of the NASB. The Legacy Standard has the same thing. When I say the same thing, meaning the traditional reading in Christianity seems to be the majority reading, the traditional. Amplified puts the two together. I'm going through these somewhat quickly because you can see them on your screen. Christian Standard also says there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, and then it puts a period. So it's none of them are saying that there isn't a 7-year and then a 62 years. They're all recognizing that there are clumps or groups, like I'm going to show you in a graphic here on the screen here in a moment. But notice they're all recognizing that the starting of these 490 years, the 70 weeks of Daniel, has a definite starting point, but there's something significant that takes place after the first 483 years, i.e. the 7 plus the 62. So Holman Christian, same thing. It talks about things that'll happen, and the impact is, when does this Messiah figure show up? American Standard Version has similar. Aramaic Bible in Plain English has the same thing. In fact, I like it says, the Messiah, the King, the departure of the word to return to build Jerusalem and to the coming of the Messiah, the King, is 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Messiah, the King. You like that? Look at Brenton's Septuagint translation, right? Brenton translated the Septuagint from the Greek, not from the Hebrew. So we have now an English translation. And it also says, and thou shalt know and understand that from the going forth of the command for the answer and for the building of Jerusalem unto Christ the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Again, using the punctuation, we have, there shall be 7 weeks, comma, and 62 weeks, semicolon. It also lumps those two together, allowing for Christ to show up at the end of the 483 period, as opposed to showing up at the end of the 49-year period, the first set of sevens. Contemporary English version, 7 weeks and another 62 weeks. Dewey Rames, 7 weeks and 62 weeks. English Revised Version, this one starts to get a little different. It's like the ESV earlier. It says, know therefore and discern that from the going forth of the command to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the anointed one, the prince, shall be 7 weeks, full colon, and 62 weeks it shall be built again, blah, blah, blah. I'm not sure if they exactly agree with where the Messiah is going to show up, but at least their translation seems to lend support for what I'm kind of driving at right now. God's Word translation, 7 time periods and 62 sets of 7, so it puts the two together again. Good News Translation, same thing, puts it together there. International Standard, again, puts all of them together. We say that it says there will be 7 weeks and 62. JPS Tanakh, however, which of course is put out by the Jewish community, they have no allegiance to Jesus as the Messiah. They have no recognition that Messiah is going to show up after a certain time period within the prophecy of Daniel. They strip Jesus out of the prophecy, and in so doing, their 100-year-old version of the Bible reads, know therefore and discern that from the going forth of the word to restore and to build Jerusalem unto an anointed one, a prince, shall be 7 weeks, semicolon, and for 62 weeks it shall be built again with broad place and broad moat, but in troublous times. Notice again, their arrival of this anointed person, this prince, shows up after the 7-week period, which when we look at a time chart, which I think I've got one pulled up on my screen here in a moment, we're going to see that it's impossible to put Jesus into the time frame if it's as early as after the first set of 7s, or after 49 years from the issuing of the decree. It's much too early. It's still in the BC area of time as to allow for it to be Jesus. And that's the point I'm really driving at. So I don't need to look through the rest of these. You get the idea. Most of the versions in your English Christian translations are going to be similar to the NASB that I'm used to reading. So I'll just kind of park it out there. But there are a few, like the ESV, that have some odd translations that seem to allow for taking Jesus out of the picture, or which is why I'm wondering, why would the ESV do that, or putting Jesus' arrival on the scene much too early for him to be the one that we know to be the historical Jesus Christ. Okay,